Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session. My name is Mandy Rourke, and I am so happy that you're here. I'm one of the co-founders of Zesho, and if you've listened to us before, you've been part of these sessions, thank you so much for joining us again. And if you're new here, welcome. We're so happy to have you as a listener, and we'd love for you to just put yourself into a state of comfort and sit back and relax and enjoy our conversation. I'm so excited to be having with our two fellow ladies in here today. I already said I'm the co-founder, but I'm also a marriage and family therapist in Austin, and I am super excited to be joined by Sapna, a fellow co-founder of Zesho.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Sapna Srivastav, as Mandy mentioned, fellow co-founder of Zesho. Zesho is a mental health platform that we started as a way of supporting both clinicians and the people who could benefit from their work. And Zessions is our podcast. That's a extension of that. So through Zessions, we have conversations amongst clinicians. We talk about topics that are typically addressed in the mental health world with clinicians who have the perspective of working with folks dealing with these issues on a regular basis.
Yep. And today our topic is we're going to be discussing mother-daughter relationships. And this is a very loaded topic. As we were preparing for this, we realized, and we'll continue to realize as we talk, is that these mother-daughter relationships are pretty intense and they're very intimate bonds that we get to experience, but they can also be very complicated. And so we want to talk about there's so much that we can talk about. We're already like getting prepared for a second episode, honestly, because there's just such rich stuff to consider within this. And so some things we will be getting into is just around the identity of when does the daughter's voice begin to be her own? What does it look like when there's like maybe some feelings of control in the relationships? We're also going to be talking about like the tug of war between love, identity, autonomy, and conflict as well. And not seeing all these things as necessarily bad things, but also as they are there to help us heal and understand these relationships even more. So we're so excited to have Erica Thomas with us today. Erica is a licensed psychotherapist and she has over 20 years of experience and is a recognized expert in mother-daughter relationships. She is the founder of Vita Nova Counseling and Vita Nova Mother Daughter Coaching in Liberty Hill, Texas. So, right in Austin's backyard, so not far from us. And she helps teenage girls, adult women, and families work through challenges and ultimately to strengthen their relationship. She also consults and mentors and trains other mental health professionals so that they're better able to support clients navigating the mother daughter dynamics. And she shares that outside of her work, she enjoys outdoor activities, meaningful time with friends and family. And I love this part, quiet moments of simply being present. So, welcome, Erica.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. And first, let me say thank you so much for really developing Zesho. I think it's just, I think, Mandy, the way we connected is just our love for creating that sense of community amongst therapists that I think sometimes it's so hard, particularly in private practice. So I just want to just put that out there and just extend my appreciation for both of you developing Zesho.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We appreciate
Yeah.
that. We're so
Yeah.
excited to get to connect with you and
Yeah. Well, thank you.
continue those conversations and that support and that community, and especially picking your brain always about mother-daughter relationships, including today. And so I'll jump into a little bit of housekeeping here before we really dive
Sure.
in. Just as friendly reminders, if you do enjoy our content, if you benefit from it in any way, please do consider liking, following, giving a positive rating or review on all of your favorite podcast platforms. Those ratings and reviews do help us reach more people, and those people hopefully can benefit from the resources we're putting out here on the podcast, as well as the resources that we're putting out on our website, which is zesho.com. That's zessio.com. Additionally, you can also find us on social media. We're on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, other things I'm sure that I'm forgetting. Our handle there is at myzesho, and that's MyZessio.
So we already said what our topic is. We're talking about mother-daughter relationships, but as our return listeners know, we always like to start off our episode by really defining and being clear about what we mean when we talk about mother-daughter relationships. And so let's just kind of start there. And I'll put this to you, Erica, as far as like when we start saying, let's talk about mother-daughter relationships. How are we thinking about this? And maybe I'm already asking a second question. Why do you feel like this is such an important topic?
Yeah. Well, so really the mother-daughter relationship is such an integral relationship because the mother is the first example of what it is to be a woman for a daughter. And, whether the daughter is, whether the daughter grows up and she goes and she kind of becomes her own person, the foundation that where she comes from is what she sees from mom. And, depending on that blueprint, you could either be working from a net positive, or you could really be working from a quite a significant deficit. So it really does shape how you navigate yourself as a woman in so many roles in our lives, from motherhood to professional to friend to, supervisor to mentor, et cetera. And it's just, and not only that, but it does show up and also in our intimate relationships as well. So, how we navigate ourselves as women and the narratives that we are taught as what it is to be a woman in this world and how to go about the world being that. So, that's why it's such an integral relationship. There's so many components about a mother-daughter relationship. I could go on and on, but yes, and there's also that generational piece. When I work with, the reason why it's such an integral relationship and it's such a powerful relationship is because there is a very powerful potential for generational change. So when I tell moms and daughters when they come in to see me, or even just women when they come in on their own and they're wanting to sort out through mother-daughter dynamics, they're having to do it on their own. One thing I tell them is, that I made a point to tell them that, what we're doing is we're doing this work to help you for what brought you here. But at the same time, what I also would love for you to continue to keep in your forefront, in the forefront of your mind, is that you are doing this work. This work is great, is much bigger than yourselves. You're doing work to shift the paradigm of future generations of women in your lineage, but also in women also around you. So the work that you do here is not just about improving your mother-daughter relationship, it's also about creating generational change and also getting to know yourself on a deeper level as a woman. So there's so many components to this that I think really mother-daughter work um, is, it's why it's such beautiful work really for women.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, I'm struck when you're sharing kind of how it serves as an example for how to become a woman. And I think that's so powerful in so many ways, but I'm also thinking of those who really
Mhm.
like have a really tumultuous relationship with their mothers, and
Mhm.
who may not have had a mother who was in a place to be as much of a role model or take that role with them as often, and how hard that can be of like, I didn't maybe have that example in my mother specifically. And so I'm curious, I mean, there's so many different ways that you can characterize. I think that's kind of what stuck out to me. So I wanted to name that, and we can kind of come back to
Mhm.
that maybe later on a little bit.
Mhm.
But I was thinking of that too, and kind of how we're characterizing like what conflict can often look like between mothers and daughters, and particularly in the way that plays out kind of in your clinical work and with the clients that you end up seeing.
Mhm. Yeah, usually when, moms and daughters come to me, most of the time it's because they're feeling unseen and unheard by each other. Okay, that's like the first and foremost. Now, as we dig deeper, you get to see a lot more, and there's a lot more to work with there. But it's usually they're not understanding me or where I'm coming from. They're not validating me. They're not seeing me. And so they feel unseen and unheard. If we reflect back on, so a lot of my training comes from the mother-daughter attachment model, which was developed by Rashka Hasseldine. And, one of the mathematical equations she writes is um, being unseen plus being unheard equals being unloved. So when you're not seen and you're not heard, you don't feel loved. So they come in not feeling loved by each other. And that ends up affecting their connection. As we dive deeper into that, they figure out that it's much more than just being that. That's just only the symptom of really what's going on much deeper. So, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not just about communication.
It's not just about communication, no.
We're not communicating well.
Yeah.
We communicate
It's
differently. Like, no, there's what's below the surface with that.
what's below the surface. Another thing too is sometimes two daughters distancing themselves from mom, and mom gets really confused. She's thinking, growing up, we had such a great relationship. And, over these past few years, I can hardly get a hold of her. She doesn't return my calls. She avoids me. And, there's so there's that also that brings them to mother-daughter coaching. And come to find that there are just some things that happened um back in yesteryear that caused daughter to not want to be close to mom, and at some point mom did not make it safe for her to really open up and share. And but then also, so there's just so many so many components to this lack of boundaries. My daughter is trying to establish boundaries, and mom is getting very insulted by them, very put off by them, and wondering, why are you shutting me out? And meeting those boundaries with a lot of judgment and a lot of shame. Maybe daughter has done some therapy on her own, and she's learned how to develop healthier ways of being and how to really come about her own healing. And mom is not understanding boundaries. But when we look at it more, we also find out too that mom herself does not have good boundaries. She doesn't understand what boundaries are. She doesn't understand that boundaries are actually essential for good relationship. Some of that is a cultural component, and some of that is just their own life experience. But that comes into play. Either there's abandonment issues that come into play. So there's also that trauma piece that can come into play when daughter is saying, um, you know, please don't call me every day, you know, uh, and mom gets hurt. So there's these are the ones that I'm mainly seeing. Now, when it comes to teen daughter and mom, what I find is mom is not really taking the time to, and actually a lot of it has to do with there is the lack of knowledge around her daughter's developmental stage and where she is biologically, why she is reacting the way she does, not understanding that adolescence, which goes from 12 to 24, um, as Dan Siegel defines it, the first part of that is about learning, really understanding and establishing your autonomy and your individuality. And even though maybe daughter doesn't necessarily have the skills to properly assert her boundaries, her view, her points of view, and start to implement her own individuality, she does so. And mom not understanding that, she ends up punishing her for it, shaming her for it. And so there's those components. Now, daughter may have not done it the proper way. You don't cuss your mom out, right? But,
Mhm.
Understanding too that when you understand that, adolescence is part of, just that daughter's I need to be my own person. I want to be my own person. I want my voice to feel heard. Then they understand that, and then we can work through it and work to transform that in a way that's more productive.
Oh
Yeah.
man.
Yeah.
I have so many feelings about that because I'm taking notes too. But the first thing that comes up is being a mom of a little
No.
one. She's going to be 9 this summer, so I still have a few years to go here. But even as you were talking about that, I felt my chest tighten of like, my
Yeah.
baby. Like she's not, I'm
Ah,
not going to be her favorite person anymore. What do you mean? Like she's not just going to be like, love you, mom, or like, little things that I'll see her do that I did. And I'm like, hey, don't,
oh, yeah.
you don't need to copy
Yeah.
me or, stuff like that. But it
Yeah.
does
Yeah.
make me think about just well several things. I mean, one, it's like how in the world do you prepare as a mom is maybe one arm of this conversation, and then something I think we'll probably flesh out in a little bit is just talking about how this shows up in different phases of life too, because even then it's like what we're talking about with just this life event of transitioning from being a young
Yeah.
child to adolescence. It's not just what the teen is going through, it's also what the mom is going through, and I think that tightness in my chest is grief. Like, no.
Oh my gosh, that's so insightful. Yes, you're right. I think, when we do move through those transitions of motherhood, so I have a daughter myself. I have my two oldest are boys, and then my baby's a girl. But yeah, I'm going through those transitions. And yes, as motherhood, right? And just really as parents in general, we go through these transition periods where our kids are growing up. And not only are we having to teach them how to grow up, to be, I don't know, just really kind of live up to their potential, to be the best person they can be. But while we're doing that, we're also, I think sometimes parents lose sight of is that we also have to grow up with them. So the way we engage with them ends up being different. So, it's interesting you say that, Mandy, because when I do work with parents of teen girls, they do come in and there is a sense of fear. And I feel like, well, first of all, I feel like teenagers are the most misunderstood human beings on this earth. There's so much going on with them. They're like the internal balls of energy that are ready to explode and ready to show up in this world in a certain way. Their neurons are on fire, and sorry, I'm gonna get geeky on you, but
Please.
science geeky on you. I love science. So, but so internally, I mean, there's just so much potential and kinetic energy going on that yeah, you can feel it as a parent. You're attuned to your kid, you're going to feel that. So I think really, so yeah, that you get stories around society saying, oh, wait till she becomes a teenager, and you see movies and you see teenage girls, yelling to parents that I hate you, and they're slamming doors. And yeah, there's this fear that this precious little girl that they have now that they can communicate with and connect with, they're just like counting down the days till they lose them. And they're scared of that. And what I love to do is I love to show parents that it doesn't have to mean that. And that I'd love to take the fear out of parents in raising teen girls, because if you do that, I mean, you're able to show up for that girl, for that little girl who's growing up into this young woman in such a meaningful way. You'll still have so much to contribute to her. And being a teenager, it won't mean that you have to lose your connection with her. As a matter of fact, you can actually strengthen your connection with her, if you show up in the right way. But yeah.
I love that way of framing it of it's kind of just your connection and the way that you're connecting with any of your kids really is just taking a different shape. It's just going to look a little bit different. It's going to grow into something new, but you kind of have to let it. You kind of have to give it the room for both you and your kid to develop into that and find that. And it's a tough transition, I would imagine, especially in teenage years, but even
It is. Yeah.
beyond. And something that kind of both of you were saying that has really been a point that I do want to bring up is kind of the unacknowledgement that tends to happen of what parents and especially moms go through of like that kind of has to like go under the rug or is like secondary, but it's so
Mhm.
heavily at play in the dynamics. It's just maybe not always named as overtly of like it feels like, we need to focus on the kid and like make sure they're doing okay but like mom's going through stuff too. Like she's struggling, and because she's in the role of mom, who is usually a caretaker role, it's so easy for what mom's dealing with to not be named or not be acknowledged. And I'm curious of like how that comes
Mhm.
up in your work and in maybe even in your personal life too, of like
Mhm.
um because I noticed that I'm, you know, the only child of a mother who's largely raised me on her own, and um I think as I've gotten older, I've done a better job of acknowledging, and I can still do a better job of acknowledging like what she's going through on a regular basis. And so I can only imagine, especially with teens, like maybe it's not their job
Yeah.
necessarily, but it's still at a role that's playing into the dynamic and that deserves to be acknowledged from mom. So what does that usually look like for your clinical
Yeah.
work?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, well, thanks for asking that question because I think it's really important. I think that work actually starts with mom. Okay, so when I'm working with teens, with teen girls and moms, one thing that we start to flesh out is are those generational patterns in their mother-daughter history? Just personally speaking, when one of the reasons why I got into my work, right, was my own relationship with my mother. And I come from a generation of very strong women who, really beginning with my grandmother, really intentionally started breaking dysfunctional generational patterns. Okay, so in their own way. What I love is with this work is that mothers with teen girls is that they can break that cycle. They can break those cycles at a much earlier age, and daughters do not have to suffer, uh, you know, through years of that before they start getting to that healing. They could move on into their adulthood as adult women and really be healed with, this generational change. But, on a personal note, my grandmother broke some generational patterns around abusive relationships. And, she ended up marrying a very good man. Uh, but there are things that she brought because of her own trauma that ended up hurting my mom immensely. So when my mom got married, she wanted to be a mom. And that's why she actually really, really wanted and was praying for girls because all she had were brothers. So she ended up getting 2 girls. But, she before just as she was transitioning into motherhood, she intentionally really thought about, "What am I not going to pass on?" Right? And this is what I don't want. I don't want my daughters to feel the same hurt, and I don't wanna pass on that hurt. So my mom did a really wonderful job of that. That said, there were things that unintentionally she passed on that continued the hurt. And, so I'm able to exist here today because of the intentional work that started from my grandma to my mom. And I think it's wonderful now. I was able to take that work and continue to build upon it with my daughter. And I, I've had, self-disclosure, I've had my own done a lot of inner work, particularly with my mother-daughter within my mother-daughter relationship. Um, what the hurts in that relationship, um, just the complications of that for me and how that shaped me and my view of self going into womanhood, but also going into motherhood. And I wanted my daughter to have a different blueprint, just like my mom and my grandma did. So I'm just building upon that. And, my daughter now, we have a very great relationship. She's 18, going off to college. I mean, she's fearless. We're able, I've had enough of my work to be able to be okay with her really communicating her own boundaries and for me to say, "Okay, I got it," you know?
Mhm.
And, so it is a lot of work on that regard, um, but it's it's a, I lost my train of thought there.
It is.
Please ask me that question again. Please ask me that question again because I was going somewhere with it and I
Yeah,
can't
no,
remember, but I knew it was an important part. But
you're totally fine. Yes, no, you're right there. I was asking kind of the role of like acknowledging what moms are going through and
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
the how that plays
Thank
out in a
you.
dynamic. Yeah.
Thank you for asking that. Yes. So landing the plane. So really, personally and professionally, right? One thing I do, I've done my own work around this. I've also really helped women really ensure that they don't get lost in that one role of being mom and that they're more than just mom. Being a mom is a beautiful thing. And, you know, it's, it's a beautiful thing, but also helping them understand that they have all these other parts to them and which are really important to breathe life into them because eventually it changes and it grows and children leave the nest, right? And you're going to exist differently as a mom. You'll always be mom, right? But your role is going to completely change and the way you're going to connect with your daughter is on a very completely different level. As an adult, it'll be more woman to woman rather than mother to daughter. Um, parent-child dynamic. So what I really do, and it's something for me personally. And my mom was so entrenched in her motherhood. I didn't really know her very much as a woman. Even things like I didn't really know her favorite color, favorite food. And, so there were just certain things. And so when I went into my adulthood as a woman, it's like, okay, I was looking at my blueprint and I'm like, okay, well, how do I exist as a woman? Right. And I had my own ideas. But I had to really kind of construct that for myself, and I think a lot of women do anyway, but when you're coming you can either, like I said from the get, you can have a really great net positive and say, "Okay, this is what, my mom taught me, what it is to be a woman." But and then there's some women like me that I was like, "Okay, I don't know. I don't know, so I guess I'm gonna have to figure it out." And I did, but that's an important, really dynamic that I think is just important for women to understand that they are people first. All these other roles, even with high functioning women that I work with who are, entrenched in their work, right? Just having them also understand who are they aside from their professional role.
Mhm.
Eventually, that role is going to change, whether they spend a lifetime and they retire out of it, or maybe sometimes they just decide they want a career change and do it voluntarily, or sometimes, unfortunately, involuntarily, and their roles change. So, understanding and being able to have that flexibility with yourself as a human being amongst roles really helps us stay connected with ourselves in a much healthier way.
I'm glad you brought that perspective up because it just makes me think about how we are talking about mother daughters, but that is from the context of like those are the roles that we carry within the
Mhm.
relationship. But also, I think what you're alluding to here, like describing, is we're more than our roles, right? Like our daughters are more than being a daughter, right? We are more than being a
Yes.
mother, and so the work does start with even acknowledging that. I think that's, um, I don't know. I feel like there's probably a lot of stuff in society that kind of reinforces this notion of like mother, like what it means to be a good mom or what it means to be a good daughter. And then that's just reinforced over time and time again. But when you bring up boundaries, it made me think about like boundaries specifically around like sense of self as a woman, like how many times that I'll be going out with my closest group of girlfriends and my daughter. And granted, all of their kids are friends with my daughter too. So it's not like she's like completely
Sure.
left out of this dynamic, but we'll do just a mother-daughter night. And she's like, "Well, why can't I come?" like, honey, like you have to understand, like it's important for me to have my own friendships just like you have your own friendships. And as you're
Yes.
describing that, it makes me think of just how many boundaries around your time, around just how you live your life that are important for just you as a woman to have to feel whole, but also it feels really important to model for the daughter too, to say like this, like I am over here doing my own thing as a woman and I'm giving you permission to do the same thing, and it starts so early. So I
It
really
starts
like
so
that you brought
early.
that up. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to be an or. It
Right.
should always be an and. I can be
Hmm.
this and this,
Yeah.
you know? And so I think sometimes you're right. I think there are those societal, kind of prescriptive roles that sometimes women were kind of put into of, this is what good mothers do. This is what a good spouse does, right? This is what a good, so all these roles that we think, that society tells us we should.
Mhm.
It's just it's just interesting because I went to a networking function a couple weeks ago, and this networking function was I was in a room of very accomplished women. These women were C-suite women, and we were talking about mother-daughter dynamics. And one of them happened to bring up about, and this was culturally influenced of, and sometimes it just creeps up in her. She's done her own work, but sometimes it creeps up like, okay, am I a good mom if I do this? Am I a good mom if I don't do this? So, these prescriptive roles sometimes that society has for us really breeds ground for a lot of shame and guilt for women. And that's just, it's so unhealthy.
Yeah.
So,
Well, on that note, it's, I think, definitely a shameful and judgmental environment. And I think I
yeah.
wrote this down earlier when we were talking about different phases of parent, like mother-daughter relationships and what can kind of shift. And one specific example popped into my mind where there was some shame involved, but there was also just a ton of criticism in the relationship. And so, just like a quick little synopsis of what was going on, it was a key issue between a young mother of two young children and her having her mother step in and help as a grandmother in her
Mm,
absence.
mhm.
But boundaries were not really considered from the grandmother, and at this, so that caused a lot of frustration and anger truly from the daughter, the other mother of the young children. I feel like I need to draw a family tree here. um but all this to say that I really talked with them so much around like the root of that criticism, like what was going on. Like there was so much like critical judgments from both sides. Well, why would you parent your kids that way? Well, why won't you respect what I'm doing the way that you're doing it? Why did you parent me that way? And so I think
Mm,
maybe I'm starting to open up a
mm,
little bit of a conversation around that phase of life too, and how um, man, it kind of goes back to some of the first things that you were talking about, like the grandmother in this case may never have observed boundaries in her life, or maybe has ever had boundaries in her life. And so as the daughter's like crying
mhm,
out for them, there's just a huge area of opportunity here that they were able to get curious and also compassionate about why it was so hard for them to
mhm.
navigate this. I'm curious about kind of your take on just that quick little example.
That's beautiful. Yeah. No, it's interesting that I just caught that phrase, the other mother, right? Because sometimes that happens, right? Where when the boundaries are blurred, kids start to think they have two mothers. There's two mothers now in this construct. There's not a grandmother and there's not a mother because those roles are not distinct. And so mother steps in over, sometimes undermines a daughter. And like you said, you have that shame and you have that guilt put upon you, and just this judgment, right, of what good mom should be doing. So I think that eh, blurred boundaries are something that I think sometimes families think that closeness is not having boundaries. Like you can say anything, you can do anything, and and although there is a certain, a certain a level where you can have that flexibility and that openness and that, be able to hold each other's space in that way, really relationships, healthy relationships do have healthy boundaries. And, but as I'm thinking about what you're saying, Mandy, I think about also just those generational patterns that are in the mother-daughter history that really are the core cause of why they are arguing, right? So, just some of the patterns that we go over in our mother-daughter work, one of the ones I think about is the culture of female service, which is part of the mother-daughter attachment model that I mentioned earlier. And, there's a certain sense of, what role does the female play in that family and their expectation to be of a certain service in the family. And depending on how you are raised, if you are raised in a very patriarchal, male-centered household, right, the male is going to, um, a lot of the household will center around that male energy, right? And the female energy I think eventually it does tend to partner up, but there's always a dominance in that male energy. And and you're susceptible to falling into those gender role expectations, of what women are supposed to do. So I think about when I think about that mother and that daughter is I'm thinking about what patterns are they arguing about in their mother-daughter history. So
Yeah.
yeah, it could be, I don't, there's another one called maternal jealousy, which is an interesting one. That one is centered a lot around grief, mom's unmet needs, mom's unfulfilled dreams. Maybe daughter is in a certain place that mom really never was able to get to. And as a result of that, sometimes she starts to look at daughter in a very highly critical way, because she's jealous, but she's also grieving that she herself did not get there.
Mm.
So that's a real complicated one. So yeah, so I can't help but to think what patterns there
Mhm.
really are at the core.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Oh, there's so many directions I feel like coming from that kind of discussing that example and a lot of what you've just brought up. So I'm trying to think of like
Yeah.
what I'm following first. I feel like as we've been talking this whole time, and I think you started to bring it up in
Mhm.
this example that you talked about of like the culture of female service and kind of how that looks different in different cultures, and the
Mhm.
influences that has like the role of culture keeps coming up for me too of
Mm.
because I mean I think even just the expected role of motherhood in my culture, like South Asian, is very
Mm.
collectivistic, but is very like kind of established. I think you said something when you were talking about kind of your mom and her role as a mother. I think you said she was very entrenched in that role, and I feel like
Mhm.
that's kind of almost an expectation for moms in my culture and probably a lot of others too. And
Yeah.
so that
Yeah.
makes me really curious of like, what does that tend to look like? How is that addressed usually, or how is that acknowledged in your work with families?
Mhm. That one can take a couple of different directions. So, the first one I think about is, kind of your modern woman, right? Who, even in it just they're bucking and they're questioning the reason why we are doing this. Why are we doing this? It doesn't make sense, so I'm not going to do it like this because this makes more sense to me. Particularly, I think with women of color, it becomes quite difficult because then it gets entrenched into, well, then why are you abandoning your roots, right? So, and you know, for me, I have a lot of pride in my roots, but some of those expectations and those kind of prescripted roles and how we are supposed to exist in within that culture, like, but why? Why? It doesn't make sense to me. So so it's just interesting. I think about the story of when I come home, back from college my freshman year, and we were sitting at the table, and my mom was fixing dinner, and my dad was sitting at the table, and this is just something that the Hispanic culture is. It's just the woman makes a meal, serves the plate and all the utensils, drinks, everything, all the accoutrement. It's all there in place, and then my mom was running around, and then my dad says, and very nicely, he's like, "Can I get a fork, please?" And I look at my dad, and I'm like, "Dad, mom is working really hard. She's trying to get dinner. You can get the fork." And he looked at me, and he wasn't insulted or anything. It was just kind of such a strange dynamic. You would think that maybe it would be where it would, like, the whole thing would explode, but he just kind of looked stunned at me, and he's like, "Ah, yeah, I guess I could." But what I'm saying is sometimes the culture is so entrenched and it becomes so part of the DNA that we just do what we do. But this is the very same man that when I was a first time mom, I was contemplating, okay, should I really want to go back to work? Because I love my work. But then I was also torn between that and then, like, oh, but should I be the stay at home mom? Which sometimes our Hispanic culture tends to, like, encourage, and maybe not so much now, but back then I felt it. And I come from, my parents are immigrants, so when you are kind of that first generation born here, that influence just is much greater. So I really wanted to go back to work, and my grandmother, rest in peace. She asked me, "So, what are you gonna do? Are you gonna go back to work, or are you gonna stay home?" And I told my grandma, I said very confidently, I was like, "No, I'm gonna go back to work." And she says, "Oh, really?" And she says, "Oh, well, I was watching this telenovela, and she's telling me how eventually, like, this little boy considered the nanny the mom because the mom wasn't around all the time. So I am a young mom. I'm like 24 years old. And first time mom, I was visiting my parents at that time. So I go back where I was staying with my parents. I was so upset. My dad saw me crying. He's like, "What's wrong?" And I said, "Well, this is what grandma said." And he goes, "Mija." Because Mija's my daughter in Spanish, a term of endearment. And he says, "Mija," he says, you are more than just a mom. And he said, "You need to go back to work if that's what is going to make you happy." So, these are stories I think about, we as women when we're mothers. And I think these are things that we need to really raise our daughters from a very young age, that they can exist in several roles and it be okay, right? It's not just one or the other. So, so I just think it came from my dad. But I think really I was thinking is this is really something that should come from moms, right? So to this day, I've been able to hold both of those, being a mom and being a working professional, quite gracefully, and graceful equity, um, for over 25 years. My oldest is 25 now. But I think that's just an important conversation that moms need to be able to have with their girls from since when they're really little, you know? So,
That
yeah.
that does I think it speaks to, because I'm hearing a lot of like the cross-generational, cross-cultural, like child of immigrants thing coming on that I'm very much identifying with right now as well, because my parents were immigrants as well. And I think it kind of reminds me of a previous podcast that we've done too, of like kind of choosing the components of the culture that are right for you and kind of what you want to create. And so it's
Mhm.
also kind of choosing the components of your role as a mother that feel right for you, feel authentic for you, both from your roots as well as from where you live now, that are authentic for you, that work for you and the family that you want to create, the future you want to create. as well as kind of making sure that you're creating roles for yourself and like enhancing the way that you want to operate as within your own identity as a woman, in addition to
Mhm.
being a mother, in addition to being a partner, in addition to being a sister, a daughter, a friend.
Mhm.
The ways that you're crafting that for yourself in ways that are authentic to
Yeah.
you, again, pulling from the best parts of where you're from and where you live and who you were raised by and where you want to lead your family into. And
Mhm.
so I
Mhm.
appreciate that. I feel like I was hearing a lot of those themes, and I just wanted to
Yeah.
reiterate that I love that.
Oh, thanks. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I
Mm.
also just appreciate so much that your dad really did see you in that.
Mhm.
And I know you were saying like ideally this would be a conversation that would come from moms, and I think that I think we all keep saying this. There's so many things to say on this because yeah, I'm thinking about myself
Mhm.
as a mom, I'm thinking about myself as a daughter and all the other roles, and um I think something that comes up for me is like in working with individuals that maybe I don't have the opportunity to work with the individual daughter and their mom
Mhm.
is how to help them process that, right? Because I'm thinking about, I'm just going to use your example since it's so fresh in my mind, where I could imagine, let's say, um, you came to a session as my client and you were frustrated by that, and that whole dynamic, and maybe I should share personally. Sometimes I get frustrated by seeing like, whoa, like sit down and chill, mom. Like we're here to hang out. Like you don't need to be serving everybody, and then
Right.
there's a layer of that where like my daughter sees that, just like I would anticipate your daughter would observe you being like, Dad, you can get a fork, like so there's like the
Yeah.
role
Yeah.
modeling piece of this, but then I'm also thinking about those inherent messages that come up that again, it kind of goes back into like what I should be doing. Like I'm supposed to be fulfilling these roles, but then as I'm saying all this, if I am helping someone in session deal with kind of like their frustration around that, like I don't like the way that our family has operated over years. So it's essentially like that process of differentiation that Sutton is referring to, right? Like I want to take the parts that I enjoy or that I like that align with me, and I want to kind of leave behind the other ones that don't. But I feel like
Yes.
that's such a hard process to do individually. Not that every session needs to be mother-daughter, but it's almost like the therapist has to be able to encourage the individual daughter to really think about going back to those patterns. Like, it's not like your mom's doing anything wrong because it's different than
Mm.
how like you might or I might choose to like interact in my life as a family or as a mom. But I do oh, my watch just went off. Sorry about that.
No, it's
Cut this section out at 1209. Um, okay. But I think it's helping the individual daughter process. It's essentially goes and going back to Dan Siegel's stuff where it's like helping them see like what is their internal see here and what is their internal experience and how did they arrive to make those choices, because as you were talking about your family too, it's like, okay, like, who knows what the first version looked like with your grandma. And so from your mom's perspective, she might be like, yeah, like I took the parts that work for me. I left the ones that don't. And then it's
Mhm.
almost like you're like, hey, I'm taking the parts that I like for me, but it looks so different. But I think I'm
It
getting
does. Yeah.
incredibly wordy here, but it's like, how might you work with just an individual daughter in a case like that to help them truly be curious about, their mom's lived experiences in that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we definitely do, we definitely go over their mother-daughter history, and we go over, there's 8 different patterns, that are part of this mother-daughter attachment model, which are actually, by the way, universal patterns across across cultures. They're just colored different. They just show up differently by culture. But so we go over these. What I think it is important for the daughter to be able to see the humanity, right, in mom and mom, and I think that's just a really important piece because not only are you bringing into your mothering, right? Just you're not only bringing in yourself as a mother, but you're also bringing yourself in as the adult woman, and you're also bringing yourself in with your inner child, that little girl part of you, who sometimes that's where all your hurts are. So it is really important, I think, for them to understand that, not necessarily to excuse it, of course, but more so as an explanation. Um, so that, they themselves can also be aware of these patterns, and then they can also make those corrections. But I, I think it's really important to shed light on that human part. You know, maybe mom wasn't. I know she caused you a lot of hurt and a lot of pain, uh, and that's not okay. And you should never have gone through that. And I'm sorry you did. There is this component, though, that I think is important to consider, that mom brought in her hurts into her mothering and parented you, with those hurts that also caused you the hurts. So it's a what I talk about is emotionally starved women raise emotionally starved women. So thinking about just that generational piece is really important. But also I think also is, okay, what makes sense to pass on and what doesn't? Because maybe there's some things that they're able to see that mom did that they do want to pass on, but because they're so entrenched in the hurts, they didn't see that. you know Maybe mom, was the first one in her family to go to college, and she broke that cycle. She wanted to you know do more, do other things with her life, right? She was the traveler. She broke all of these things, but because she caused the daughter so much hurt, she's now also realizing that there's also these good components that came with mom as well, and that she can pass on. But yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Mhm.
If I'm missing something, please let me know.
Yeah. No,
Yeah,
I think it does.
yeah,
I think I'm also thinking of, because I think there's so many ways that that can go, but I think that makes
yeah,
sense as a first step, and it that kind of relates to a lot of what we've been talking about, of kind of how
yeah,
do you see, the mom's role and your mom's role for that matter, and acknowledge
yeah,
your own when you become a mother too. But I'm also thinking about something that we haven't completely touched on yet, that I do want to at least touch on briefly if we can, is like the role of identities. I know we talked about kind of the various roles that moms tend to
mhm,
have as women, generally as well. But I'm also thinking about that as like with daughters too, and the multiple roles that they have, the identities that each of them have, and how there can be a lot of overlap but a lot of separation, but those tend to be blurred. Like, yes, boundaries can come in, but even like identity, like I feel like there's a lot of oftentimes kind of over identifying, or trying to resist that over identifying sometimes. I don't know if I'm speaking from experience or anything or not, but I was curious about that
yeah,
dynamic and how that
yeah.
tends to be addressed.
Yeah, one of the things that we talk about when we are, and that kind of comes with the connection piece, and when we are working on that connection piece, and one of the things that we talk about is emotional reality and making space for that. So emotional reality, just for your listeners there, is one's own subjective experience of the world around you, which can be shaped by your values, your beliefs, past hurts, right? Just all these things that just really shape how you see the things, and versus factual reality, which is reality based on facts, right? Your age, your occupation, the weather, what it is today. So just things that are facts, right? What happens is when moms and daughters come in, they often find themselves fighting to be right rather than holding space for their individual perspective of things. They don't have to agree with each other. You know, um, it's, essentially it's okay to agree to disagree. However, with an added layer of appreciation that both of you are coming into this relationship as beautiful individual women, right, with individual perspective of things, and then that's okay. So to be able to exist with a duality of, these just the differences of opinions, but still loving each other. I don't see it that way, but that's okay if you do, and I could see where that might come from, versus sometimes we get caught up in the dynamic of like we're in court, we got to be able to convince that person beyond reason of a doubt that they are wrong, right? Or that I am right. And they do that for different reasons, right? They do it because either they're trying to fulfill unmet needs. Sometimes too, it's I really didn't mean to hurt you, and let me tell you why I didn't mean to hurt you. So it's that kind of over explaining from a very apologetic place, but it becomes very invalidating. And so, really, that when we talk about kind of being able to exist with each other's individuality and identity, is being able to exist in that same space with our individual identities and still be able to connect, even if we don't see eye to eye. So, yeah,
I think there's so much work that goes into that, right? Like that's such a
there is.
process that I think having support is really wonderful, right? To have someone to kind of be the
Absolutely.
other voice, to interrupt some of that butting of the heads that probably, I mean, I could see some of these patterns that we've been referring to start pretty early on.
Yeah.
On
Hmm.
the concept of identity, we've recently been looking at a lot of pictures of my nana, and then that means also pictures of my mom from early ages, and it is like unbelievable how similar I look to my nana in certain photos, like facial
Ah,
expressions, right? And then even talking about my mom, I mean, there are pictures that I'm like, oh, and I'm like, that's not me. I mean, some strange moments where I'm like, we really
mm,
do have so many similarities there. And when I think about identity, I'm talking about physical appearance here, but I'm talking about it through the
sure.
lens of like how on such a subconscious level, I mean, there's such a strong attach. I mean, there's always been such a strong attachment to my Nana and also with my mom, but also it's like, yeah, I mean, these women look like me, like, like I can almost like
Right.
predict like what the next, 50 years of my life will, as far as like,
Yeah.
aging and all of that. But
Right.
I just think that it makes me feel like that can make it that much harder to be outside of yourself in having those conversations because it's almost
Mm,
like there's just such a like not even a blurred line doesn't really explain it, but it's just like it feels like such a continuum of like, yes, you
right.
are my nana, but I'm also your granddaughter. But really, I mean, like I technically was in my nana's body at one point, right? Like based on how, so there is just a lot of like biological considerations here that are at play as
Absolutely.
far as like, wow, like there is such a strong attachment, but it doesn't mean that like you stepping outside to like witness that from an observer standpoint and say like, okay, like send all the love and like compassion for each of their experiences, but then to give yourself permission to be like it's okay if it might look very similar to them, but also my life can look slightly different in the ways that serve me, and that's okay.
Mhm.
But I feel
Mm,
like you see where I'm going with that. It almost feels like kind
yeah.
of foreign in some ways, like what, like I need to just kind of
Yeah.
follow in their footsteps, like they are me and I am them, in some like
Right.
deeper level, existentially speaking.
Absolutely, which is actually all the more important, right, for a mom to really get to a place where the daughter it to validate the daughter's just autonomy and her individuality. Because I think there is, just that biological tie, right? Like you said, I know I see pictures, right, of my mom, and as I get older, I look a little bit more like her. And it is kind of an interesting thing because there is this kind of almost a subconscious, I don't know, it's an interesting thing. I don't know if you feel it, you feel it. I don't know if you could ever describe it, but
Mhm.
it's a which is, like I said, I think it's all the more reason for a mother to get to a place where she can understand her own self aside, and being able to exist and be able to nurture all those parts of self so that when her daughter is growing up, her daughter you know, can even if she has that feeling, she can totally send her back to a place like, but you know what? It is okay to be me. I might look like Nana and probably look exactly like Nana, but I'm me and that's okay, you know? So,
Oh,
yeah.
I love that. I feel like there's so much more there that I would love to explore, like things like legacy and expectations
Yeah.
around that are coming up for me here too. And so
Yeah,
I'm tempted
yeah.
to go in that direction, but I also want to acknowledge our time here. And so um we got to a lot of things, but there's also a lot of things that we haven't gotten to. And so were there any
Yeah.
like kind of um any things that you wanted to make sure that we touched on, re-emphasize, kind of give as takeaways, or leave
Yeah.
as seeds for
Yeah.
some future episode or episodes at this point that we might end up doing?
And I'm here for all of that, by the way.
Yay.
As are we.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah.
So, right, no, I think, one of the things that I want to make sure your listeners leave with today is that, if you are a mother, that you make sure that you breathe life into all your parts of you, because that person who is able to breathe life into all those parts of her and understand that there's all these parts of her can raise a daughter who can exist in the same way, knowing there's all these parts of her. Right. So I think that's one thing. Number two is mother-daughter work is working on something greater than yourself. Yes, you are working right now in the immediate on this generation between you and mom. But the work that you're doing is now you're going to have a daughter who is going to have some healing and is going to go out into the world, whether it's she's going to have a daughter, or she has a daughter, or if she doesn't, even if she's a mom of boys, uh, she exists with other women, and these patterns play out with other women. All us women, we bring in our mother-daughter histories into our relationships. So if she's able to find healing on that, she's able to exist in those relationships differently. And I think lastly is really being able, one of the biggest ways to really stay connected with your mother and daughter, with between mother and daughter, is really being able to hold each other's emotional reality, where it's okay to exist as individual beings with individual opinions, but know that you can still be connected at the end of that. Even if you argue, even if you have a little spat or even a big spat, but to know that there is this underlying understanding, like, yeah, I know who you are. I know that you're this person and I still love you and we can still be connected. And so I think those are really important things that I hope your listeners can go away with today, step away from today. So,
Those are phenomenal. Thank you for sharing
mm,
those. I
yeah.
especially I love all of those, honestly. I can't choose a favorite, but they all resonate in different ways. Thank you so much
Thank you.
for having this
Oh,
conversation with us, starting this conversation with us at this
Yeah,
point.
starting for sure.
Truly, there's so many more directions to go in, so
yeah,
we'll hopefully have more of those in the future. But thank you for taking the
that's
time for
wonderful. Yeah,
sharing
thank you.
yourself and your expertise. This has truly been
Oh,
such a rich and enlightening conversation. And I know I will go back
thank
and
you.
listen to it myself and
Yeah. Oh, well,
encourage others to.
Yeah.
thank you all so much. And thank you for sharing your personal stories. I really think, just also bringing stories in just it's really made this conversation just so much richer. So
It definitely got lost in the conversation, that's for
thank
sure.
you for,
Yeah, for
I want
sure.
more.
yeah,
Yeah,
thank you for
exactly.
bringing yourselves also into
Yeah,
it. So
my
yeah,
Well,
thank
how
you.
pleasure.
can we find you, Erica? Or if anyone wants to work with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So my website is Vita Nova, Vitanova counseling.com. You can also find me. I'm on LinkedIn under Erica G. Thomas. I'm also on Instagram. My handle is at vita.nova.counseling. And then I'm on Facebook, Vita Nova Counseling and Vita Nova Mother-Daughter Coaching. So my handle is at VNLHTX. So that's where I am.
That
Oh
works.
my goodness. I
We'll
know.
add that to the show notes
Yes,
too.
we'll
So
have all of that written on there for
Thank
you.
you so much.
yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for
Um,
taking the time to be with us today. We are very excited
Thank
about the
you.
next conversation we'll have, and I'm sure there's
Absolutely.
and we may ask our listeners for more feedback because I'm sure, I mean, this piqued more curiosities for me and my work as a
Yeah.
therapist, but also just as a mother and a daughter. So we'll definitely be eager to get feedback from any of our listeners to share,
Yeah.
what do you want to know
Yeah.
more of? And
yeah.
while I'm sharing that about the feedback, this
Yeah.
will also be in the show notes too. So make sure y'all take a minute to find Erica's information, but also we're going to submit a link for y'all to click on in the event that you want to join our newsletter so that we can share amazing resources like this podcast episode through that newsletter, as well as any of our future offerings that we'll have from our partners that are so amazing like Erica. So please visit our show notes and subscribe to that newsletter, and also share this conversation with anyone, any of your other mother-daughter friends that you might have. We hope that it was really helpful for y'all. And again, excited for the next one.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks so
Thank
much,
you all.
Erica.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.